For 312 standard years, humanity had been a footnote in galactic records, a quiet species marked by archivists as compliant, limited, and strategically relevant, a civilization that had signed the Accord's peripheral peace and then done exactly what it promised by stepping aside, dismantling most of its visible military infrastructure, redirecting its industry toward trade and civilian science, and withdrawing from contested systems without protest, and from the alien point of view. This had confirmed every bias they already held, because the galaxy was old, cruel, and deeply hierarchical, and species that survived at the top did so by dominance, while those that yielded were assumed weak. So when humanity retreated from border zones and allowed fast-expanding empires to absorb resources humans once charted, the High Coalition interpreted it as quiet surrender rather than deliberate restraint. And over generations, this narrative hardened into doctrine taught. In command schools and diplomatic academies, humans were cooperative but soft, inventive but undisciplined, emotionally volatile but strategically predictable, a species that burned hot and then burned out, and no one alive remembered the wars that had forced humanity to sign the Accords in the first place, wars whose details were sealed behind redacted clauses and memory holes because even the victors had found the cost unsettling. So the galaxy moved on while humanity watched, built, and waited, not in secret bunkers or mythical superweapons, but in layers of logistics, redundant systems, cultural patience, and a philosophy that treated time as a strategic asset. And this first part of the story began not with a battle, but with a meeting on Cairo Station, where Ambassador Leonard Ward sat across from a semicircle of coalition envoys who barely bothered to hide their boredom as they informed her that several human-administered trade corridors would be reclassified under coalition protection due to regional instability, which was a polite way of saying seized. And Ward listened calmly, her face neutral, hands folded, asking only clarifying questions while the envoys congratulated themselves on their civility, because a century earlier such an announcement would have sparked outrage, but humanity no longer barked at shadows. And when Ward finally spoke, she said that humanity acknowledged the reclassification and would comply, a response that triggered subtle amusement among the envoys, some of whom exchanged gestures of satisfaction, because compliance was what humans did now. And yet when Ward returned to her shuttle, she sent a single encrypted message to Earth containing only coordinates, timestamps, and one line of text that read begin phase retrieval. And across human space, that message propagated through systems invisible to coalition, systems embedded in civilian shipping networks, academic research arrays, and cultural exchange platforms that had never stopped mapping, monitoring, and modeling the galaxy in exhaustive detail. Because stepping aside had never meant disengaging. It meant choosing not to contest terrain until the moment contesting it mattered, and far from Cairo Station, on a quiet agricultural world named Laconia, Admiral Jonah Reyes stood in the field watching automated harvesters move through rows of grain while a holographic projection scrolled beside him showing the same message Ward had sent. And Reyes, who had commanded no public fleet for 30 years and wore no visible insignia, nodded slowly and said it was time to wake Logistics Command, and that phrase rippled outward, activating contingency protocols that had been rehearsed in simulations so complex they required distributed planetary computing to run, protocols designed not for conquest but for reclamation, because humanity had never intended to rule the galaxy, only to ensure it could never again be boxed into a corner by entities that mistook patience for weakness. And as the coalition finalized its reclassification orders, human merchant vessels altered routes by fractions of a degree, data packets shifted priorities, and manufacturing contracts adjusted timelines, all mundane actions individually, but collectively the first movement of a vast machine that had been idling by design. And elsewhere in coalition space, a junior analyst named Serac of the Veil species noticed a statistical anomaly in trade flow model showing human shipping tonnage increasing along non-strategic vectors, which he flagged out of academic curiosity rather than alarm, because human commerce had always been erratic, and his supervisor dismissed it with a flick of a manipulator limb, reminding him that humans lacked the centralized will for coordinated action, a statement pulled verbatim from a century-old doctrine file. And that file had been written after the last time the galaxy underestimated humans, though no one remembered that part anymore. And so the galaxy continued its routine, unaware that humanity had not taken anything back yet, but it had just finished standing up, and the quiet centuries were over. The coalition did not notice a shift at first because it looked like compliance continuing as usual, human worlds filing paperwork on time, ambassadors attending sessions, trade flowing without tariffs or blockades, and that normalcy reassured leadership far more than open resistance ever could. Yet beneath that surface, the galaxy's balance of dependency began to tilt as human logistics specialists rerouted supply chains with surgical precision, quietly terminating contracts that had made peripheral systems reliant on human maintenance crews while simultaneously activating dormant clauses in mutual aid treaties with minor species the coalition had long ignored. And these clauses were old, buried under layers of ceremonial language, but they were binding, and they compelled humans to provide assistance in times of instability, which the recent reclassification conveniently qualified as. So fleets that appeared civilian by registry began arriving in contested systems carrying repair platforms, medical facilities, and modular infrastructure, greeted by local populations with relief and gratitude, and those populations in turn began redirecting allegiance not through rebellion but through contracts, because humanity understood something the coalition never had, that power built through obligation was quieter and far more durable than power seized through force. And on Earth, the Retrieval Council convened for the first time in public memory, not a ruling body but a coordination forum composed of governors, fleet architects, economists, cultural historians, and a rotating civilian oversight panel, all of whom treated the situation with calm professionalism rather than urgency because the timelines had been modeled centuries in advance, and when Admiral Reyes addressed them he did not speak of revenge or domination but of correction, explaining that the galaxy had drifted into an inefficient configuration where stability was maintained through intimidation rather than interdependence, and humanity intended to restore balance by reclaiming responsibility for the systems it had once stewarded, not with battles but with leverage, and that leverage manifested when coalition patrols began encountering human ships that refused inspections not by force but by legality, presenting jurisdictional codes older than the coalition itself, codes derived from pre-Accords exploration charters that had never been fully revoked, and the patrols escalated these incidents up the chain only to discover that human legal teams had already filed challenges in multiple forums, creating procedural deadlocks that froze coalition response times, and while bureaucrats argued, humans acted, deploying rapid fabrication nodes that turned resource-poor systems into self-sufficient hubs within weeks, undermining the coalition's economic grip. And on Caro's station, Ambassador Ward attended another session where the envoy's tone had shifted from bored to irritated as reports accumulated of coalition influence waning in regions where humans had supposedly withdrawn centuries earlier, and when accused of bad faith, Ward replied evenly that humanity was fulfilling its obligations to maintain regional stability, the same justification coalition had used, and the symmetry of it unsettled them because it revealed that humans had not been absent, merely patient. And this realization spread unevenly, some commanders dismissing it as coincidence while others, particularly veterans of long-memory species, felt a creeping unease as patterns emerged that matched fragments of suppressed history, and among those was archivist Threx, who accessed sealed records against protocol and discovered accounts of the first human expansion. Not a tale of conquest, but a methodical integration where humans embedded themselves so thoroughly into the functioning of galactic society that removing them later had required drastic measures and mutual agreement to forget. And Threx understood then that the current events were not escalation but resumption, humanity picking up a thread it had set down deliberately, and as this understanding dawned too late across the coalition, local governments began requesting permanent human presence, citing efficiency and trust, and each request was logged, approved, and fulfilled, expanding human influence without firing a shot, and the galaxy that had once watched humans step aside now found itself turning toward them again. By choice, setting the stage for the moment when the coalition would realize that everything it thought it owned had already been promised back to its original caretakers. The coalition's leadership finally convened an emergency summit when 3 core member worlds reported identical outcomes within the same cycle. Human-administered stabilization teams had arrived under treaty authority, resolved infrastructure failures the coalition had ignored for decades, renegotiated trade terms in favor of local governments, and then been formally invited to stay. And this pattern shattered the long-held assumption that loyalty flowed up with the power because these worlds were not rebelling. They were defecting politely, and the Supreme Convener Valdez addressed the chamber with visible strain, acknowledging for the first time that humanity's actions appeared coordinated, a word that caused murmurs because coordination implied intent, and intent implied capacity the coalition had dismissed, yet even then many delegates argued that humans were overextending. That soft influence would collapse without military backing, a claim rooted in their own cultural logic, where power and violence were inseparable, but human doctrine treated force as a last resort precisely because it degraded systems they preferred to inherit intact. And while the summit debated, Admiral Reyes authorized a reveal of Tier 2 assets, not fleets but archives, opening access to human-maintained historical databases for any species willing to participate. Databases that did not rewrite history but contextualize it, showing economic models, demographic flows, and conflict resolutions across centuries, and species that accessed this information began to realize how often human mediation had quietly prevented wars by adjusting incentives rather than deploying weapons, a realization that reframed humanity not as passive but as custodial, and this reframing gained momentum when a border crisis between the Krell Dominion and the Yitcum Pact threatened to escalate into open war. A scenario the Coalition had failed to resolve for 50 years, and into that deadlock stepped a human envoy named Marcus Hale, who proposed a resource-sharing framework based on seasonal variability rather than fixed borders, supported by predictive climate models humans had been refining since before first contact, and when both sides accepted the proposal and hostilities ceased. The Coalition's credibility suffered a public blow because humans had solved in weeks what centralized authority had failed to manage for generations, and analysts like Serac, now more senior and far less dismissive, began compiling reports that painted a disturbing picture. Human influence maps overlapped almost perfectly with regions of long-term stability, suggesting that the centuries of withdrawal had been less a retreat and more a stress test, humanity stepping back to observe which systems collapsed without them and which adapted, and those observations fed into current actions with unsettling precision. And as this understanding spread through mid-level command structures, resistance hardened among hardliners who demanded a show of force to reassert dominance, pushing the Coalition toward its worst possible response, because humanity had anticipated that pressure as well, and deep within Sol's space-dormant shipyards powered up, not in panic but on schedule, constructing vessels optimized not for destruction but for denial, ships designed to make entire regions inaccessible to hostile operations through electronic dominance and logistical disruption, and these fleets were not announced or paraded. They simply began existing, detected only when Coalition probes failed to return data from sectors humans had marked as protected, and when questioned publicly. Ambassador Ward stated that humanity was merely enforcing safety corridors to prevent misunderstandings, using the same language the Coalition had once used to justify expansion, and the irony was not lost on observers, because for the first time the galaxy began to sense that humanity was no longer asking permission to participate. It was assuming responsibility again, and responsibility, once claimed, was very difficult to take away. The tipping point arrived quietly with a supply audit, not a battle, when Coalition quartermasters discovered that critical components used in hyperspace gate maintenance were no longer arriving on schedule, and at first this was blamed on clerical error or piracy until cross-checks revealed the truth that nearly 80% of the specialized alloys, calibration software, and trained technicians required to keep the gate network stable was sourced through subsidiaries ultimately traced back to human firms that had complied with every regulation while slowly becoming indispensable, and now those firms were honoring revised contracts that prioritized systems under human stabilization agreements, leaving Coalition core routes increasingly fragile. And when emergency requests were sent to Earth, they were answered promptly with polite explanations and alternative solutions that required local governance reforms the Coalition was unwilling to grant, exposing a structural weakness no fleet could intimidate away, and panic rippled through executive layers as delays compounded into outages, stranding ships, disrupting food shipments, and forcing once dominant worlds to negotiate with neighbors they had previously coerced, while human mediators appeared everywhere at once offering temporary relief paired with long-term integration frameworks, and many accepted because survival beat pride, and within the Coalition Defense Arm Command disagreements fractured unity as admirals argued whether to seize human assets by force, an option that looked increasingly risky as intelligence confirmed that human denial fleets had positioned themselves astride key transit vectors, not aggressively but immovably, and when a Coalition task group attempted to push through one such corridor, its systems failed simultaneously without a single shot fired, navigation collapsing, power grids desynchronizing, and crew communications dissolving into static, forcing a humiliating withdrawal broadcast across multiple civilian channels, and the footage spread faster than any official statement could contain, becoming the moment when the wider galaxy understood that human power no longer announced itself with explosion but with absence, the absence of access, mobility, and certainty. And this realization triggered a cascade of political recalculations as minor powers formally exited coalition treaties citing failure to guarantee basic services, invoking clauses humans had helped draft centuries earlier. And in the midst of this unraveling, archivist threats released controlled disclosure of previously sealed record confirming that the Accords of Peripheral Peace had been initiated at human insistence not after their defeat but after their victory, a compromise designed to prevent total systemic collapse by giving the galaxy time to rebuild without human oversight. And this revelation shattered the foundational myth of coalition superiority, forcing leaders like Convener Valdez to confront the possibility that humanity had never lost its edge, it had sheathed it. And as protests erupted on Cold World demanding answers, Valdez authorized direct talks with Earth, only to find that humanity no longer negotiated from a position of grievance but from one of stewardship, with Ambassador Ward stating calmly that humans were not reclaiming territory, they were reclaiming function, ensuring that systems critical to galactic survival operated efficiently, ethically, and without coercion, and that any polity willing to align with those principles would retain autonomy, while those that resisted would simply find themselves increasingly irrelevant, a statement that landed harder than any threat because it framed the coalition not as an enemy but as obsolete, and in that framing lay the true reversal. The moment when the galaxy realized that humanity taking everything back did not mean conquest, it meant restoring a role the galaxy had only understood after it was gone. By the time the coalition formally recognized that it was no longer the primary coordinator of galactic infrastructure, the realization felt less like defeat and more like waking up to find the furniture rearranged while you slept, familiar pieces still present, but no longer where authority assumed they belonged. And this psychological dislocation proved more damaging than any material loss because power in the galaxy had always relied on perception, the belief that the coalition was inevitable. And once that belief cracked, compliance evaporated at an accelerating rate, with worlds filing sequential notices of functional realignment that transferred traffic control, emergency response, and economic arbitration to human-led consortiums, all perfectly legal under existing frameworks the coalition itself had once championed to appear benevolent. And inside saw the Retrieval Council monitored these transitions with measured restraint, approving each integration only after extensive local referendums because humanity understood that legitimacy once lost was almost impossible to reclaim, and legitimacy was a true currency of the new order. And while this unfolded, the coalition's hardline faction made its final miscalculation by authorizing Operation Reassertion, a limited military demonstration intended to remind peripheral systems of the consequences of disobedience, selecting a lightly defended transit hub near the Taylor Reach as a target, unaware that the hub had recently entered a provisional human protection status, and when coalition strike elements arrived, they encountered not resistance but silence, their weapons locking up, sensors feeding contradictory data, and command channels overridden by a calm human broadcast informing them they were entering a restricted safety zone and advising immediate withdrawal to avoid system destabilization. A warning ignored until the hub's gravity regulators shifted phase under human control, rendering the area temporarily non-navigable and trapping the coalition ships in controlled stasis that required human assistance to escape, an outcome that humiliated coalition command beyond repair because it demonstrated not only technological superiority but ethical dominance, humanity choosing containment over destruction even when provoked. And the aftermath of the incident triggered mass resignations within coalition leadership as public trust collapsed, with citizens demanding to know how their rulers had allowed essential systems to fall under foreign stewardship without a single shot being fired, and the answer, repeated across internal investigations, was that it had happened slowly, legally, and with consent, the three factors no authoritarian structure could counter effectively, and as interim council formed and emergency charters were signed, humans remained conspicuously absent from the spotlight, declining ceremonial roles and refusing titles, insisting instead on transparent governance standards and shared oversight, a posture that confused species accustomed to conquest narratives but reassured populations exhausted by coercion. And it was during this phase that Admiral Reyes addressed a closed session of human coordinators, reminding them that taking everything back did not mean reverting to old hierarchies. It meant ensuring no single entity could ever again weaponize dependency against the galaxy, and that humanity's restraint would be tested not by enemies but by allies seeking shortcuts, and as systems stabilized under this new equilibrium, a quiet truth settled across the stars that humanity's greatest weapon had never been its fleets or technology, but its willingness to wait centuries to prove it was right. And that realization marked a point of no return, where the galaxy stopped asking whether humans belonged to the center and began asking how it had ever functioned without them. In the decades that followed the Perseus-drift incursion, the galaxies settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first because it lacked the sharp edges of dominance and submission that had defined so much of recorded history, and instead of a central authority issuing mandates, there existed a network of stewardship councils calibrated to local needs yet interoperable by design, a system humanity helped architect but did not own. And this distinction mattered deeply because it prevented fear from calcifying into resentment. And on Earth, Ambassador Ward retired quietly, her final address noting that humanity's work was not to leave forever but to ensure leadership was never again mistaken for entitlement, while Admiral Reyes stepped down after overseeing the decommissioning of the last Denial fleet assets into shared defense frameworks, closing the loop on a strategy that had begun before he was born. And historians like Threx, now openly celebrated rather than censured, compiled comprehensive accounts of the quiet centuries, documenting how humanity had stepped aside not out of weakness but out of a calculated belief that growth imposed too early only delayed maturity, and those records became required study across multiple species, not as propaganda but as cautionary instruction, and as new generations rose who had never known the coalition as an unquestioned power, the idea of governance through coercion felt archaic, an inefficient relic, and the galaxy began. Measuring success not by expansion or tribute, but by resilience, metrics humans had refined during their long watchful pause, and when asked why humanity never declared victory, never claimed the galaxy it had so thoroughly reshaped, Ward's successor answered simply that victory implied an end state, and humanity had learned the hard way that civilizations were not conquered or completed, they were maintained, and that maintenance required humility, patience, and the willingness to step aside, when others were ready to step forward. And so the final irony settled gently across the stars, that humanity taking everything back did not leave it ruling from a throne but working from the foundations, unseen by many yet essential to all, having proven at last that the greatest power was not the ability to dominate the galaxy but the discipline to protect it without demanding thanks. And in that quiet conclusion the galaxy understood what it had once forgotten, that humanity had never left. It had simply waited until everyone else was ready to catch up.